On the line with us, our old buddy, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website, democracyatwork.info, and rdwolff with 2fs.com. And you can tweet him at democracy. Actually, the best Twitter handle, I think, is Prof. Wolff, Profwolff. Professor Wolff, is all that accurate?
Yes, it is, and thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. The country of Turkey is in some considerable turmoil right now, and Donald Trump raising steel and aluminum tariffs, specifically on Turkish-made steel and aluminum, as well as other goods from Turkey, in response to apparently Mike Pence, this pastor in Turkey who has been imprisoned as a member of Mike Pence's church and or religion. And Mike Pence is quite upset about it, and so Donald Trump is doing this mano a mano with President Erdogan of Turkey. And there's this concern that it has already rattled not only the Turkish economy, and I'm sure you have the details on that, but also the emerging markets in general, other countries that are similar to Turkey in economic structure. How did this happen? How is it that a country like Turkey could be responsible for bringing down the entire global economic order, or at least, making things wobble pretty badly?
Well, the answer to that is in the core economics of the situation. The reason Turkey frightens so many people, and rightly so, is that the story of Turkey is likewise, in a way that I'll explain in a moment, the story of many other countries, South Africa, Indonesia, Colombia, in other words, all over the world, the so-called emerging markets. Many of them have a situation so close to what's going on in Turkey that it would be bizarre not to be worried about the quote-unquote contagion of the Turkish situation. So here in a nutshell is what happened. When global capitalism crashed in 2008, a decision was made in the United States, in Western Europe, and elsewhere to handle it by what we call trickle-down economics, basically to pump money into the banks that had failed, into the stock market that had crashed, basically handing it to the people who brought us the crisis, the folks at the top of the economic pyramid, and hoping that what they would do would trickle down eventually and help everybody else.
Now, this was
central to that plan was lowering interest rates, so that the United States Federal Reserve and central banks around the world dropped interest rates to record lows at, or in some cases, below zero. At this point, every capitalist in Turkey who had any plan to do anything realized that he or she could borrow money virtually costlessly in New York or London or Paris or Berlin and use it to fund whatever risky investment he had his eye on. And indeed, one of the biggest ones was building luxury housing in the middle of Istanbul and things like that for the rich, who are the only ones who can afford this thing. And for a short time, roughly from 2008 to now, a decade if you like, it created a kind of mini boom in Turkey as all of this money from abroad flooded in, bidding up the price of land, of housing, helping some companies to grow. And you had these laudatory stories about how wonderful Turkey was as an emerging economy. And just like the United States in the 1980s and 90s, nobody paid attention to the simple fact that it was all dependent on borrowed money. Not only borrowed money, but money borrowed at a very low interest rate to fund very risky investments. And true to form, because this has happened in capitalism more times than I can count on this program, it only took a little while, less than 10 years, for the risky investments to start not paying off on the one side, and for interest rates to rise because the Federal Reserve and other central banks, having overpumped money into the economy, now are pulling it out by raising interest rates, and the poor Turkish capitalists who made the risky borrowing and who made the risky investments are caught in the middle. They can't afford the higher interest rates, and the investments they made were too many, too enthusiastic, too glowingly expecting the boom to last. You know what it's like? It's like the mini boom in the United States right now that flowed from the tax cuts of last December. It won't last very long. It's leading people to borrow again in the United States. The long-term prospects of being able to pay it back are poor. And so what Turkey does is force the world that pays attention to recognize the shaky foundations of the situation economically right now and to worry themselves sick, as well they should, as to how many other countries are right behind Turkey waiting to unload on us the collapse. And by the way, little footnote, Turkey borrowed all that money in dollars and in euros. As the Turkish lira collapses in value, and it's lost nearly half its value in the last 6 months, it is, of course, impossible for the Turks to pay back those loans, since they have to give way more lira to get a unit of the currency they borrowed in. And since that's true for Indonesia and for Colombia and for South Africa, it is a disaster waiting to unfold. And the latest word from Turkey, which is that they're going to try to contain the situation by cutting government spending 10 to 30%. That's what the Minister of Finance in Turkey said earlier today. That it means that the pain of all of this is going to be loaded on to the average Turkish citizen in a literal collapse of public services. This is a disaster.
You didn't mention tariffs. The
Yes,
tariffs
the
don't play a
reason
major role in this? Is that just
No,
the media doesn't know what it's doing?
No, you know, they're interesting because it's just another example of Mr. Trump violating all the old Republican dogma that the government should not intervene in the economy, that the market works best if it's left alone, the traditional laissez-faire business. He's ignoring all of that. He's interfering. But this is symbolic. As you rightly said at the beginning, this is to placate his fundamentalist base by being a champion of a minister held over there because the Turks accused the minister of engaging in espionage. I have no way of knowing the right or wrong of this. But yes, the tariffs are just public relations activities, not just by Mr. Trump, but by Mr. Erdogan in response. The amount of trade between Turkey and the United States isn't all that big, and it will not be all that affected. And these underlying problems of the net external debt that Turkey has are infinitely larger than anything that will be affected by these tariffs and these maneuvers of the two leaders to look strong to their two constituencies.
So the precipitating event, or the inciting incident, was not the raising of the tariffs, it was the raising of interest rates by the Fed? Or did the raising of tariffs cause people to go, huh? And start paying attention to the debt in Turkey, and that then brought about, you know, a withdrawal from Turkey's markets?
No, in my perspective, the real crisis was that Turkish capitalists borrowed way more money than they should have in foreign currencies and invested it in projects that couldn't, if you take them all together, possibly be profitable for all of them in the typical capitalist investment boom when money suddenly becomes really cheap. That was going to blow up on Turkey, with or without a tariff war, with or without trade troubles. That's not a sustainable model. Much of that borrowing was what we call short-term, that it's a year or less that it'll come due, and they used it to finance real estate projects, which take years to pay off. Borrowing short-term, investing long-term is a kind of no-no that you teach students in the first year of a finance course. And so it's a capitalism working its way in the underdeveloped world, not so differently from the developed, but in an unsustainable process which has now been exposed and added to by the little dealings on the tariffs. But those are more political theater than they are basic to what's going on.
Professor Wolff, in the last minute or so, minute and a half that we have here, the New York Times, William Cohen published a piece in the New York Times a few days ago. The headline, "The Big Dangerous Bubble in Corporate Debt." He notes the domestic debt market is at $41 trillion for the domestic bond market alone. And the debt market, he says, is broadcasting a dangerous message. Investors desperate for debt instruments that pay high interest have been overpaying for riskier and riskier obligations, and that this is spread among university endowments, pension funds, mutual funds, and hedge funds, and that all of this might go down. Is this essentially the same thing as what happened in Turkey? American capitalists are doing the same thing, they just haven't been caught yet?
Exactly. That's why it is so frightening. You know, you look at Turkey and you have to, given the debt, because the same logic applied. The interest rates went to next to zero, and American corporations said, oh, goody, we can get money for next to nothing, and we can fund everything. And in the early years of that, the fact that everybody's doing it makes everyone think that the rationale for them having done it is working out and that they will make the big profits that they're hoping for. But when you put it all together, the lack of a planning system, the lack of coordination means you're going to have a capitalist boom for a few years followed by a capitalist bust. It's been the pattern for the 300 years we've had capitalism. And yes, Turkey is the canary in the mine. It is the situation that makes everybody, like Mr. Cohen in the New York Times, begin to recognize that this is not a problem limited to Turkey. They may have gone a bit further than others, so they're the first one to go bust. But the danger of the overhang of debt, of the borrowing that the federal government has done in the United States, that consumers have done, and that the corporate sector has done, raises the awful possibility that when these things turn down, the ramifications, the multiplier effect, will be the credit that collapses, and then the whole system begins to crumble. Wow.
Professor Richard Wolff, the website's democracyatwork.info, rdwolff.com, and you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff. Professor, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Tom, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Me too. I always learn from you. Thank you.
Take care.